In the summer of 1904, 6 children vanished from their deathbeds in Austin, Texas. Their grieving parents believed they'd lost them to disease. The truth was far more terrifying, and the nurse responsible? She felt nothing until the dead came for her. Before we descend into the darkness, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. This true crime horror from 1904 Austin, Texas will haunt you long after you finish reading. The summer heat pressed down on Austin like a fever that wouldn't break. In the parlor of the boarding house on West 6th Street, Nurse Adelaide Blackwood sat with her hands folded in her lap, listening to the couple across from her weep. Their grief filled the room like smoke, thick and suffocating. "Diphtheria?" she said softly, her voice a practiced blend of sympathy and clinical detachment. "It takes so many of our little ones. I've seen it happen time and again in my years of service." Mrs. Hartwell pressed a handkerchief to her trembling lips. Her husband's hand gripped hers so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Their daughter, Lily, only 4 years old, lay upstairs in the grip of fever, her small throat closing inch by terrible inch. "Is there nothing more to be done, Mr.?" Hartwell asked, though the desperation in his eyes suggested he already knew the answer. Adelaide shook her head, her expression appropriately solemn. She was a handsome woman of 42, with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes the color of rain-soaked slate. Her uniform was immaculate, starched to perfection, and she carried herself with the authority of someone who had attended hundreds of sickbeds. "I will do everything in my power," she assured them, "but you must prepare yourselves. Sometimes God calls the little lambs home." She'd given this speech before, many times. What the Hartwells didn't know, what none of her clients knew, was that Nurse Adelaide Blackwood had never completed any formal medical training. She'd worked as an assistant in a Philadelphia hospital for 3 years, long enough to learn the language of medicine, the rituals of the sick room, long enough to understand how easily desperation could be exploited. She'd left Philadelphia under circumstances she preferred not to discuss. A missing infant, questions she couldn't answer, a hasty departure in the dead of night with only a carpet bag and the uniform she'd stolen from the hospital laundry. Austin had welcomed her without suspicion. The city was growing, spreading out from the banks of the Colorado River like a stain. New neighborhoods sprouted up Hyde Park to the north, with its grand Victorian homes and tree-lined streets. Families with money settled there, families who could afford private nursing care when illness struck their households, families with children. Adelaide excused herself and climbed the stairs to the 2nd floor. The Hartwell girls' room was dim, curtains drawn against the brutal afternoon sun. The child lay in her bed, her breathing a terrible rasp that Adelaide had heard too many times to count. But this time was different. This time, she'd ensured the illness would run its course exactly as needed. The tincture of ipecac she'd administered that morning would make certain of that. She sat beside the bed and placed a cool cloth on the girl's forehead. Lily's eyes fluttered open, glassy with fever. "Mama," she whispered. "Hush now," Adelaide murmured. "Save your strength." By nightfall, Lily Hartwell was dead. The Hartwells were inconsolable, as parents always were. Adelaide helped them with the arrangements, recommended a good undertaker, stayed with Mrs. Hartwell through the first terrible night. When she finally left the boarding house 3 days later, they pressed $20 into her hand, an extraordinary sum, and thanked her through their tears for her devoted care. Adelaide walked down West 6th Street with the money in her pocket and murder on her hands, and she felt nothing at all. She felt nothing because Lily Hartwell wasn't dead. The house on the outskirts of Hyde Park sat at the end of a long, rutted drive, half hidden by post oak and cedar. It had belonged to Adelaide's late husband, or rather, to the man she'd claimed as her husband when she'd arrived in Austin. Herman Blackwood had been real enough, a traveling salesman she'd met on the train from Philadelphia. He'd been kind to her, bought her dinner in the dining car, told her about the little house he owned in Texas. She'd poisoned him before they reached San Antonio. The house suited her purposes perfectly, isolated enough for privacy, close enough to the city to avoid suspicion. She'd told her neighbors, few as they were, that her husband had died of consumption shortly after their arrival. They'd offered condolences and casseroles and hadn't asked too many questions. Inside, the house was clean but sparse. Adelaide had converted the largest bedroom into a nursery of sorts, though it bore little resemblance to the cheerful nurseries in the Hyde Park mansions. This room had bars on the windows and a heavy lock on the door. Lily Hartwell sat on a narrow bed, her face pale but alive, very much alive. She looked up when Adelaide entered, and her expression was one of confused terror. "Where's Mama?" the girl asked, her voice small. "Your Mama is gone," Adelaide said simply. "You belong to someone else now." She'd perfected the technique over the past year. A carefully administered dose of chloral hydrate rendered the child unconscious and lowered the vital signs enough to convince distraught parents their child had slipped away. While the family wept downstairs, Adelaide would wrap the body in a winding sheet, place it in her medical bag, a specially constructed case with air holes concealed in the leather, and carry it out of the house under the guise of preparing it for the undertaker. The real undertaker, when he arrived hours later, would find nothing. The confused parents would be told there had been some mistake with the arrangements, perhaps a mix-up with another family. In their grief, they rarely questioned it too closely. And if they did, Adelaide was already gone. On to the next family, the next illness, the next child. Lily Hartwell was the sixth. The first had been Thomas Chen, the 5-year-old son of a Chinese laundry owner in East Austin. Adelaide had sold him to a railroad contractor for $30, no questions asked. The man had needed workers for his gang, and small hands were useful in tight spaces. Adelaide didn't ask what happened to the boy after that. She didn't care. The second had been Emma Kowalski, taken from a Polish family who barely spoke English. $75 from a brothel madam who ran a house down near the river. The woman had smiled with tobacco-stained teeth and promised the girl would be well looked after. Adelaide took the money and walked away. Numbers 3 and 4 had been twins, Margaret and Michael Sullivan, Irish. Their parents had been devastated by the deaths from scarlet fever. Adelaide had gotten $200 for the pair from a couple in Dallas who wanted children but couldn't have them. She'd forged adoption papers, told the buyers the children were orphans from a fire that had killed their family. The transaction had been clean, almost legitimate. Number 5 had been harder. Little Samuel Wright had fought the chloral hydrate, had nearly woken up before Adelaide could get him out of the house. She'd had to increase the dose dangerously, and for a terrible moment in the back of the hired carriage, she'd thought she'd actually killed him. But he'd survived, and she'd sold him to a farmer who needed help with his land. $40. Not her best work. Now Lily Hartwell sat in the locked room, waiting for Adelaide to find her next buyer. The knock came 3 days later. Adelaide had been expecting it. Word spread in certain circles, shadowy networks of people who dealt in commodities that polite society refused to acknowledge. She'd made contact with a man named Beauregard Sutton weeks earlier, before she'd even selected the Hartwell girl as her next acquisition. Sutton was a grotesque creature, a former cotton broker who'd found more profitable enterprises in the trade of human flesh. He wore expensive suits that couldn't disguise his corpulent body or the cruelty in his pig-like eyes. When Adelaide opened the door, he pushed past her without invitation. "Let me see the goods," he said without preamble. Adelaide led him upstairs. Lily looked up when they entered, her eyes wide. She'd been crying, the tear tracks were still visible on her cheeks, but she'd learned not to scream. Adelaide had made sure of that. Sutton walked around the girl like she was livestock, which, to him, she was. He checked her teeth, looked at her hands, lifted her chin, to examine her face. "She'll do," he said finally. 200. 300, Adelaide countered. "She's from a good family, well-bred, clean, healthy. 250. Final offer." Adelaide considered. Sutton was one of her more reliable buyers, and she didn't want to lose his business. "Done. When will you take her?" "Tonight. I have a buyer in Houston, a judge, if you can believe it. He and his wife lost their daughter last year. This one's about the right age." He smiled, showing yellow teeth. "They'll never know the difference." Adelaide felt a flicker of something, not quite conscience, but close. She pushed it away. "The money first." Sutton pulled a roll of bills from his coat pocket and counted them out. Adelaide watched his fat fingers handle the cash, and for just a moment, she wondered what Lily Hartwell's life would have been like if Adelaide had never come to that boarding house. Birthday parties, a wedding someday, grandchildren. Then she took the money, and the moment passed. "I'll need the room again soon," she told Sutton. "I have another prospect. A boy, this time 7 years old, typhoid." "I'll spread the word," Sutton said. He grabbed Lily's arm and pulled her to her feet. The girl whimpered but didn't cry out. "Come along, child. You're going on a trip." Adelaide watched from the window as Sutton's carriage disappeared down the rutted drive. Lily Hartwell's pale face visible for just a moment before the darkness swallowed them both. She counted the money again, alone in the empty room. $250. She'd made over $600 in the past year from her enterprise, more than enough to live comfortably, to maintain her respectable facade. But it was never really about the money. Adelaide had discovered something about herself in those Philadelphia years, something dark and true. She enjoyed the power, the godlike ability to choose who lived and who died, who stayed with their families, and who was sold into new lives or deaths unknown. The parents' grief fed something in her, some hollow place that had existed since her own childhood. Her father had been a minister, fire and brimstone and endless judgment. Her mother had died when Adelaide was young, and her father had blamed her for it, told her she'd been born in sin, that her very existence had killed the only woman he'd ever loved. He'd beaten righteousness into her with his leather belt, locked her in the church cellar for days when she displeased him, made her memorize entire books of the Bible while she starved. When she was 16, Adelaide had poisoned him with rat arsenic mixed into his evening tea. She'd watched him die over 3 agonizing days, his body racked with convulsions, and she'd felt something bloom in her chest like a dark flower. Freedom, power, control. She'd been chasing that feeling ever since. The boy's name was Jacob Reinhardt, and he was dying, or at least that's what Adelaide had convinced his parents. She'd been attending him for a week, watching the typhoid fever run its course. Except it wasn't typhoid. It was a careful mixture of emetics and purgatives that mimicked the disease perfectly, combined with enough laudanum to keep the boy weak and docile. The Reinhardts were wealthy, their Hyde Park mansion, one of the grandest in the neighborhood. Mr. Reinhardt owned a bank downtown. Mrs. Reinhardt came from old Houston money. They had 2 other children, both girls, but Jacob was their only son, their heir. They would pay any price to save him, and when they couldn't, they would pay Adelaide generously for her devoted care in his final hours. She sat by Jacob's bedside on the 7th night, listening to his labored breathing. The boy was thin, wasted from the illness, his skin sallow. He looked genuinely ill. Because he was genuinely ill, Adelaide's poison saw to that. The trick was keeping him sick enough to convince everyone he was dying, but not so sick that he actually did. She'd lost one that way. Years ago in Philadelphia, a girl who'd reacted badly to the chloral hydrate, whose heart had simply stopped. Adelaide had buried her in the woods and moved to a new boarding house. She wouldn't make that mistake again. Mrs. Reinhardt appeared in the doorway, her face haggard. "How is he, Nurse Blackwood?" "The crisis approaches," Adelaide said gravely. "The next few hours will tell." "You should rest, Mrs. Reinhardt. I'll stay with him." "I can't rest, not while my boy suffers." "Then at least sit with him. Talk to him. Let him hear his mother's voice." Adelaide left them alone, descended the grand staircase to the 1st floor. Mr. Reinhardt sat in his study, a glass of whiskey in his hand, staring at nothing. Adelaide paused in the doorway. "You should go to your wife," she said softly. "She needs you. Jacob needs you both." He looked up at her with hollow eyes. "Will he survive the night?" Adelaide shook her head slowly. "I've seen many cases like this, Mr. Reinhardt. Once the fever reaches this stage, you must prepare yourself for God's will." He broke then, this powerful man who commanded respect in every boardroom in Austin. His shoulders shook with silent sobs. Adelaide watched without expression, then quietly withdrew. By dawn, Jacob Reinhardt would be dead. By noon, he would be in Adelaide's locked room. By nightfall, she would have made contact with her buyers. She'd already identified the market for a boy like Jacob, well-educated, from good stock, the right age to be trained in any number of professions. The possibilities were endless. A factory owner who needed cheap labor. A ship's captain who recruited boys for cabin work. Perhaps even another childless couple who could afford to be less discerning than the judge in Houston. Adelaide returned to the 2nd floor and waited in the hallway. She could hear Mrs. Reinhardt's soft voice through the door, reading to her son from a storybook. A tender moment. A memory the woman would carry for the rest of her life, never knowing it was built on lies. The house was quiet, except for that soft murmur of words. Outside, Austin slept, unaware of the monster in its midst. The monster who wore a nurse's uniform and spoke in sympathetic tones and stole children from their beds. Adelaide checked her pocket watch. 3 more hours until she would administer the chloral hydrate. 3 more hours until Jacob Reinhardt died and was reborn as property. She felt nothing. She felt nothing at all. But someone was watching. In the shadows, at the end of the hallway, stood a figure Adelaide couldn't see. Small, child-sized, with empty eyes and a mouth frozen in a silent scream. Thomas Chen, the first child, whose small body had given out 3 months after Adelaide sold him to the railroad contractor, crushed between 2 cars while clearing debris from the tracks. Emma Kowalski, the second, who died of violence and infection in the brothel by the river. They'd thrown her body in the Colorado before dawn, weighted down with stones. The Sullivan twins, Margaret and Michael, who'd survived only 2 weeks with their new parents in Dallas before the couple realized they couldn't control them. The children had been locked in a cellar and forgotten. Starvation was a slow death. Samuel Wright, the fifth child, who'd been worked to death in the fields outside Bastrop. 9 years old, and his body had simply given out under the Texas sun. And now Lily Hartwell joined them in the shadows, her neck broken when Judge Carver's wife had pushed her down the stairs in a fit of rage just 3 days after her arrival in Houston. The woman had wanted her own daughter back, not some replacement. The judge had buried Lily in his garden under cover of darkness and told his wife they would try again. 6 children, 6 ghosts, all watching Nurse Adelaide Blackwood with eyes that held death and accusation. But Adelaide, alone, in 2, the hallway, felt nothing. Not yet. Jacob Reinhardt's death went exactly as planned. Adelaide administered the chloral hydrate at dawn, watched his breathing slow, his pulse become almost imperceptible. She called for the parents, her face appropriately grave. Mrs. Reinhardt's scream echoed through the mansion. Mr. Reinhardt simply stood frozen, as if his grief had turned him to stone. Adelaide did what she always did. She comforted, she made arrangements, she spoke in soft tones about God's mysterious ways. And when the time came, she wrapped Jacob's small body in a winding sheet and placed him carefully in her medical bag. "I'll take him to the undertaker myself," she told them. "You shouldn't have to see him like this. Remember him as he was." They nodded numbly, too broken to question, too devastated to notice the air holes in the leather. Adelaide carried her prize out into the morning light. The hired carriage waited at the end of the drive. She climbed in, placed the precipitated bag carefully on the seat beside her, and gave the driver directions to the house outside Hyde Park. Behind her, in the windows of the Reinhardt mansion, 6 small faces watched her go. But Adelaide didn't look back. The carriage rattled through the streets of Austin. The city was coming alive around her, shopkeepers opening their doors, workers heading to their jobs, children running to school. A normal morning in a normal city, where normal people lived normal lives. Adelaide was not normal. She'd known this for years. Perhaps she'd known it since childhood, since those days locked in her father's cellar, since that first perfect moment when she'd watched him die. She was something else, something hollow and dark and hungry. The carriage reached her house. She paid the driver and carried her bag inside. Jacob would wake in a few hours, confused and terrified, just like all the others. She would feed him, explain his new circumstances, and wait for Beauregard Sutton to arrive with news of buyers. But first, she needed to count her money. Adelaide went to her bedroom, to the loose floorboard where she kept her earnings. She pried it up and reached into the dark space beneath. Her hand touched something cold, something small and thin and not made of paper. She pulled it out and stared. A child's finger bone, still wearing a small gold ring. Adelaide's blood went cold. She'd known anything like this. She'd never kept trophies from her victims that would be foolish, evidence of her crimes. She reached into the hiding place again. More bones, small femurs, ribs, vertebrae, all child-sized, all clean and white, as if they'd been picked clean by time or something else. At the bottom of the hiding place, where her money should have been, lay a single piece of paper. Adelaide pulled it out with shaking hands. Written in a child's careful handwriting, asterisk. "We want to go home." Asterisk. The paper fell from her fingers. Adelaide stood quickly, her heart hammering in her chest. This wasn't possible. No one knew about the hiding place. No one knew about any of this. A sound came from downstairs. A child's laughter. high and clear. Then another child's voice, joining the first. Then more, a chorus of children laughing and singing in her house. Adelaide grabbed the pistol she kept in her bedside table and moved toward the hallway. The laughter continued, echoing through the house. It should have sounded joyful. Instead, it was the most terrible sound she'd ever heard. She descended the stairs slowly, the gun raised. The parlor was empty. The kitchen was empty. But the sounds continued, coming from everywhere and nowhere. The door to her locked room stood open. Adelaide's breath caught. She'd locked it that morning. She always locked it. Always. She moved toward the door, her hand trembling on the pistol. Inside, Jacob Reinhardt still slept in his chloral hydrate stupor. But he wasn't alone. 6 other children stood around his bed. Thomas, Chen, Emma Kowalski, Margaret and Michael Sullivan, Samuel Wright, Lily Hartwell, all of them dead, all of them here. They turned to look at Adelaide, and their eyes were hollow sockets, their faces marked by the violence of their deaths. Thomas's skull was crushed on one side. Emma bore the unmistakable signs of her abuse, her small body broken. The Sullivan twins were emaciated, their skin hanging from their bones. Samuel's face was burned dark by the sun that had killed him. Lily's head sat at an unnatural angle, her neck clearly broken. "We want to go home," they said in unison. Their voices were like wind through a graveyard. "We want to go home." Adelaide raised the pistol. "You're not real. You're not real. You're—" Thomas Chen moved forward, his crushed skull tilting to one side. "You sold me for $30. I didn't," Emma Kowalski followed. "You sold me for $75. The Sullivan twins spoke together. $200 for both of store. Us. Samuel Wright, $40. Lily Hartwell, her head lolling, $250. Adelaide backed away. The pistol felt useless in her hand. "How do you shoot what's already dead?" "You took us from our mothers," Thomas said. "You stole us from our beds," Emma whispered. "You killed us," the Sullivans intoned. "You sold us," Samuel added. "And you felt nothing," Lily finished. They moved toward her, these dead children, these ghosts of her greed. Adelaide fired the pistol. The bullet passed through Thomas Chen's transparent form and buried itself in the wall. She fired again and again until the chamber was empty. The children kept coming. "We want to go home," they chanted. "We want to go home, but we can't. Because of you." Adelaide turned and ran. She bolted down the stairs, through the parlor, toward the front door. But the door wouldn't open. The windows wouldn't break. The house had become a prison. The children appeared at the top of the stairs, watching her struggle. Behind them, a 7th figure emerged from the locked room. Jacob Reinhardt. Awake now, the chloral hydrate wearing off. He looked around in confusion, saw the other children, saw Adelaide. "Where's my mother?" he asked. The dead children turned to him. They spoke gently, kindly. "She thinks you're dead. The nurse told her you died." Jacob's eyes widened. He looked at Adelaide with dawning horror. "But I'm not dead." "Not yet," Lily Hartwell said. "But you would have been. She would have sold you, like she sold us. And eventually, you would have died, like we died." Jacob began to cry. Adelaide watched, trapped in her own house, as the ghost children surrounded the boy. They comforted him with cold, dead hands. They whispered to him in voices that held the grave. And then they turned their attention back to Adelaide. "You felt nothing when you killed us," Thomas said. "Nothing when you sold us," Emma added. "Nothing when we died." The Sullivans continued. "So now you'll feel everything," Samuel concluded. "Everything we felt," Lily whispered. They descended the stairs together. This terrible procession. Adelaide screamed. She beat against the door until her hands bled. She threw herself at the windows until her body was covered in cuts from the glass that wouldn't break. Nothing helped. Nothing saved her. The children reached her. Their cold hands grabbed her arms, her legs, her throat. Adelaide felt their pain flood into her every moment of fear, every second of agony, every instant of their dying. Thomas's crushed skull, Emma's violated body, the Sullivan twins' slow starvation, Samuel's final moment of heat stroke, Lily's neck snapping. She felt it all. And she felt the one thing she'd avoided her entire life: remorse. It poured into her like poison, like acid, burning away everything she was, every child she'd taken, every family she'd destroyed, every life she'd sold. The weight of it crushed her, drove her to her knees. "Please," she begged. "Please, I'm sorry. I'm sorry." "You're not sorry you did it," the children said together. "You're only sorry you were caught." They were right. Even now, even in her terror, Adelaide knew they were right. The children's grip tightened. Adelaide felt her breath leaving her body, felt her heart beginning to slow. This was how Emma had died, she realized. This was how it felt to be murdered. "We want to go home," the children whispered. "And you're going to take us there." They found her 3 days later. Beauregard Sutton had come to the house looking for Adelaide, wondering why she hadn't responded to his messages about potential buyers for the Reinhardt boy. He'd brought the sheriff with him, claiming he had business to discuss with Nurse Blackwood. The front door was locked, but the windows were all shattered from the inside, as if someone had been trying desperately to break out. They found Adelaide in the parlor, slumped against the prize wall. She was alive, but she wasn't herself anymore. Her hair had gone completely white. Her eyes were vacant, unfocused, seeing things no one else could see. When the sheriff tried to help her to her feet, she started screaming. "They're here!" she shrieked. "Can't you see them? They're here! All of them! The children!" The sheriff and Sutton exchanged glances. Upstairs, they found Jacob Reinhardt, alive and unharmed, sleeping peacefully in the locked room. They found the medical bag with air holes. They found Adelaide's records, carefully hidden, detailing every child she'd taken and every transaction she'd made. They found the bones in the floorboard. The investigation that followed uncovered everything: the false identity, the murdered husband, the stolen uniform, the trail of missing children stretching back to Philadelphia and forward through Austin. 6 children dead, 1 recovered alive. Adelaide Blackwood was tried, convicted, and committed to the state asylum in Austin. She would spend the rest of her life there, in a small room with bars on the windows, screaming about the children who visited her every night, the children who made her feel what they had felt, the children who would never let her forget. Jacob Reinhardt was returned to his family. The Reinhardts held him and wept with joy and never quite understood how their son had come back from the dead. They didn't ask too many questions. They were simply grateful. But in the asylum, Adelaide Blackwood knew the truth. The dead children had used her to save the one they could still save. They'd revealed her crimes to return Jacob to his home. They'd made her feel everything they'd suffered, and now they would make her feel it again and again and again for the rest of her days. Every night, They came to her cell. Thomas Chen, Emma Kowalski, Margaret and Michael Sullivan, Samuel Wright, Lily Hartwell. "We want to go home," they whispered, "but we can't because of you." And Adelaide would scream until the orderlies came, until the laudanum took effect, until blessed unconsciousness claimed her. But even in her dreams, the children waited. They would always be waiting, because some debts can never be repaid, and some sins can never be forgiven. In Hyde Park, in the grand Victorian homes along tree-lined streets, families tucked their children into bed and kissed them goodnight. They locked their doors and closed their windows and never knew how close darkness had come to their doorsteps. In East Austin, in the modest homes where immigrant families struggled and thrived, parents held their children a little closer after hearing rumors of the nurse who stole babies. In the mansion on Hyde Park Boulevard, Jacob Reinhardt woke from nightmares he couldn't quite remember, and his mother came to comfort him, and eventually the nightmares faded. But in the asylum, Adelaide Blackwood never slept peacefully again. The children made sure of that. Justice, in the end, had come, not from the courts or the law, but from the dead themselves. The dead who refused to rest. The dead who demanded payment for what had been stolen from them. Their lives, their futures, their homes. Adelaide had sold them for money. Now, they owned her soul, forever. Adelaide Blackwood spent her final years in the Austin State Lunatic Asylum, dying in 1912 at the age of 50. Her official cause of death was listed as acute mania and heart failure. But the night orderlies told a different story. They said she died screaming, clawing at invisible hands around her throat, begging children only she could see for mercy. The house outside Hyde Park burned down in 1908 under mysterious circumstances. No cause was ever determined. Some say if you visit the site today, you can still hear children laughing in the darkness. 6 children stolen, 6 lives destroyed, 1 monster brought to justice not by the law, but by the dead themselves. If this story sent chills down your spine, smash that like button and subscribe for more true crime horror stories from history's darkest corners. Drop a comment below. Do you believe the ghosts of Adelaide's victims really haunted her, or was it guilt that drove her mad? And don't forget to tell me where you're watching from. I love hearing from viewers all around the world. Until next time, sleep well, if you can. Remember, subscribe, like, and share this story. These victims deserve to be remembered.